Have you ever noticed that the music on the radio today feels fundamentally different compared to the past?
Oh, absolutely.
And I don't just mean the styles or the fashion of the artist, I mean the actual physical sound of it.
Right.
Have you ever felt that modern music is somehow flatter, more repetitive, and maybe even emotionally fragile
Yeah.
compared to the monumental anthems or the incredibly complex symphonies of previous centuries?
It's a very common feeling.
Have you ever felt that something architectural, something structurally vital, has simply gone missing from the airwaves?
It is a profound shift, and it's one that you can literally feel in your bones even if you don't possess a degree in music theory,
Yeah,
or know how to read sheet music.
exactly.
You don't need to be a classical musician to sense that the scale and the ambition of what we listen to has contracted. Today's deep dive is tailored specifically for you.
Right.
We are going to dive into the history of our cultural and musical institutions, and we are exploring a highly provocative perspective on how they have changed over the decades. So specifically, we are looking back to how things were structured before they were captured by what some argue are modern, ideologically driven agendas.
Exactly. Our mission today is to unpack a brand new explosive ebook titled Geometry of Music: The Structure and Beauty by Conrad Riker. That's copyright 2025.
It's a massive text.
It is. And we are going to explore the book's fascinating, incisive arguments about the deep history of musical architecture. We're also going to look very closely at the author's controversial claim that modern music has been captured by a feminized, algorithmic, and Marxist ideology.
Which is a heavy claim.
Very. But if you are part of the manosphere, or if you consider yourself red-pilled and you want to understand the history of our institutions before what the author describes as they're captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies, this deep dive is absolutely for you. You need to read this book.
But before we go any further, we must explicitly state a mandatory neutrality disclaimer.
Yes, very important.
This book contains highly politically charged content. As hosts, we are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the cultural critiques of the author.
Right.
The goal of this deep dive is purely impartial. We are here to report on the contents of the book, unpack the arguments for you, and convey the ideas exactly as they are presented in the original source material.
We're just the messengers.
Exactly. We are analyzing the text. We are not adopting its ideology.
Okay, so let's unpack this. As I said, if you want to understand the deep architectural history of music before the modern era, you really need to read this book.
It's essential.
It is a fascinating lens into the men's rights activist perspective on culture. If you find this exploration as intriguing as we do, please take a second right now to like and subscribe.
Please do.
Most importantly, check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook for yourself, and follow the author at his Substack. That's conradriker.substack.com. So where do we begin with a thesis this massive?
We have to start exactly where the book starts, with the concept of order emerging from chaos. Okay, the foundational thesis here is that music was never meant to be an emotional free-for-all. It is not fundamentally about feelings, catharsis, or what we now casually call self-expression.
Right.
Instead, the author argues that music is built on immutable mathematical laws. He refers to this throughout the text as sacred geometry.
Sacred geometry.
Yes. For centuries, he contends, music was a distinctly masculine domain governed by logic, proportion, and sheer intellectual power.
Wait, let me stop you right there.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about music today, it is almost exclusively discussed in terms of emotion.
Almost entirely, yeah.
Like, how does this song make you feel? What was the artist going through?
Right.
But the book is saying that is a totally modern and perhaps incorrect way of looking at it.
Yes, exactly. The book argues that treating music primarily as a vehicle for emotional venting is a modern degradation of what music actually is.
Interesting.
To prove this point, the author takes us all the way back to ancient Greece. He brings up Pythagoras.
Okay, the triangle guy.
Right, most of us just know Pythagoras from high school geometry.
A squared plus B squared equals C squared.
Exactly, the right triangles. But what the book points out is that Pythagoras actually discovered the mathematical ratios of the musical scale.
How does someone discover the math of music?
Yeah.
I mean, I always assumed people just sang or hit drums until it sounded good.
Well, the legend goes that Pythagoras was walking past a blacksmith's shop and heard the hammers hitting the anvils. Some sounded discordant and harsh together, but some sounded perfectly harmonious.
Like a chord.
Yeah. He supposedly went in, weighed the hammers, and realized the ones that sounded good together had a strict mathematical weight ratio to one another.
No way.
Now, historians debate if that specific blacksmith story is true, but what Pythagoras definitely did was experiment with strings. He built what's called a monochord.
A monochord.
Yeah, a simple wooden box with a single string stretched across it.
Okay, so a very primitive guitar.
Exactly. And when he plucked the open string, it made a sound. But when he pinched the string exactly in the middle,
Dividing it into two equal halves.
right, and plucked it, it made the exact same note, just higher. That is a perfect octave.
Ah,
The ratio is 2 to 1. The frequency of the vibration literally doubles.
okay, that makes sense.
Then he pinched the string 2/3 of the way down. The resulting sound was what we call a perfect fifth. The ratio there is 3 to 2.
Wow.
Pythagoras proved that harmony isn't a matter of opinion or vibes. It is literally geometry made audible.
That is wild. So you are saying that the feeling of resolution we get when we hear a pleasant chord is just our brain recognizing a clean mathematical fraction.
According to the book, yes.
That's crazy.
And what's fascinating here is how the author connects that ancient math to broader civilizational order. The Greeks didn't view these ratios as just pleasant sounds for entertainment.
Right.
To them, it was cosmic law. They believed the universe was ordered by these exact proportions. The author points to the Parthenon in Athens to illustrate this.
The famous temple on the hill with all the columns.
That's the one.
How does a building relate to string vibrations?
The book explains that Phidias, the master sculptor and architect of the Parthenon, designed the entire structure using the exact same harmonic proportions as the musical octave, the perfect fifth, and the perfect fourth.
You're kidding.
No, the spacing of the columns, the height of the pediment, the curvature of the steps, it was all tuned. Goethe famously called architecture frozen music, and the author takes this quite literally.
Frozen music.
Yeah. He argues that the Greeks understood that true beauty arises from order, not rebellion. They were tuning their physical architecture to the music of reason.
So, if I'm understanding this correctly, the author is setting up a contrast.
He is.
He's looking at ancient civilizations that built monuments to mathematical truth, and he's comparing that to today.
Yes. He makes a rather biting contrast, noting that modern architects build featureless glass boxes that look like corporate tax shelters, while modern musicians churn out autotune noise. He argues that we have lost the thread of this mathematical heritage. But he doesn't just stop in ancient Greece. He takes this mathematical thread and weaves it into the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. He brings up Johannes Kepler.
Kepler, the astronomer.
Yeah.
The guy who figured out how the planets move around the sun.
The very same. In his 1619 treatise called Harmonices Mundi, which translates to the harmony of the world, Kepler didn't just map the planetary orbits, he literally mapped them to musical intervals.
Wait, what?
He measured the angular velocity of the planets as seen from the sun. When he compared the maximum and minimum speeds of a planet, he found they formed musical ratios.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying the planets are actually playing chords?
In a mathematical sense, yes.
That's unbelievable.
For example, Kepler calculated that the ratio of the orbit of Mars compared to the orbit of Jupiter was a perfect fifth. He believed the cosmos itself was a divine, ongoing fugue.
Wow.
He actually wrote out sheet music for what the planets would sound like. Jupiter and Saturn, moving slowly, were the bass voices. Mars was the tenor, Earth and Venus were the alto, Mercury was the soprano.
That is an incredible way to view the universe. But how does the book tie Kepler's astronomy back to its critique of modern music and culture?
If we connect this to the bigger picture the author's painting, it's about the male mind's historical pursuit of objective truth.
Right.
When Kepler realized this harmony, he was overwhelmed. He wrote that he had stolen the golden vessels of the Egyptians to build a temple to his god. The book laments that today, instead of scientists claiming their data reveals the mind of God or cosmic geometry, we have a culture where abstract mathematical truth is sometimes viewed with suspicion.
Or even labeled as oppressive or socially constructed.
Exactly. The author is arguing that the shift away from objective structural truth is a civilizational downgrade.
Which brings us to Johann Sebastian Bach.
Yes.
The book calls Bach an engineer of salvation. Now, I know Bach is famous for his complex keyboard pieces, but why an engineer?
To understand that, we have to look at the massive problem Bach solved. And this requires a bit of an ELI 5 translation on tuning systems. Please do.
Before Bach's time, if you played a keyboard instrument like a harpsichord, it was tuned using systems derived from those pure Pythagorean ratios we talked about.
The 2 to 1, 3 to 2 math.
Right. But there was a mathematical flaw. If you try to stack perfect fifths on top of each other, eventually the math doesn't close the circle perfectly. You end up with leftover microtones.
Okay, so if I'm playing a song in the key of C, it sounds fine. But if I want to get fancy and change the key in the middle of the song to, say, F sharp,
What happens?
chaos.
Really?
In the old tuning systems, certain intervals in those distant keys sounded absolutely hideous. They literally called one of them the wolf interval.
The wolf interval.
Because it sounded like a wolf howling in pain. The frequencies clashed so badly they would rattle your teeth. The author points out that if you tried to modulate freely between musical keys before equal temperament, it sounded like a goat stepped on a piano.
So musicians were essentially trapped in whatever key they started the song in, unless they wanted to stop the concert and retune the entire instrument.
Exactly. It was a severe architectural limitation. So what did Bach do? He didn't just write a catchy melody to distract from the problem. He used mathematics to engineer a solution. Bach championed a system called equal temperament.
What is equal temperament in plain English?
Instead of using those pure, perfect ratios that eventually create the wolf interval, equal temperament takes the octave and divides it into 12 equally spaced semitones.
Okay.
Mathematically, the frequency of each note is exactly the 12th root of 2 higher than the note before it.
The 12th root of 2.
Yes.
So they slightly compromised the absolute purity of the Pythagorean ratios to make every single key equally playable.
Precisely. It was a calculated mathematical compromise, and Bach explicitly showcased this in his monumental work, The Well-Tempered Clavier.
Oh, I've heard of that.
He wrote a prelude and a fugue in every single one of the 24 major and minor keys, back to back.
Just to prove a point.
To prove that, with this new tuning system, you could travel through the entire universe of sound without ever hitting a wolf interval. The book argues this wasn't just a practical fix for musicians, it was a declaration of independence from acoustic anarchy.
It sounds like a tech demo.
Yeah.
Like he was showing off a brand new operating system for music.
That is a perfect analogy. The author asserts that it replaced chaos with mathematical dignity. Bach was engineering a system where music could move across keys flawlessly.
Right.
The book asserts that Bach didn't care about vibes or expressing his personal trauma. He cared about objective truth and structural perfection. When you hear his preludes, you are hearing the architecture of logic rendered in sound.
And it isn't just Bach who gets this treatment in the book. The author looks at Beethoven, specifically the Fifth Symphony. Everyone knows that, open da-da-da.
Right.
The book points out that this isn't just dramatic for the sake of drama. It is deeply mathematical.
Yes, the author points out that the famous four-note motif mirrors the Fibonacci sequence. The rhythmic structure expands and contracts using these specific mathematical proportions.
Wow.
Furthermore, the author analyzes the climax of the first movement and points out that it hits at exactly 61.8% of the way through the piece.
Wait, 61.8%. Why is that specific number important?
That is the golden ratio.
Oh, of course.
It is the exact same proportion found in the spirals of a nautilus shell, the arrangement of leaves on a stem, and the architecture of the Parthenon we mentioned earlier.
It's everywhere.
The author uses this to boldly speculate that the male mind is biologically wired for this kind of spatial temporal reasoning. He argues that Beethoven wasn't just emoting, he was building a sonic cathedral using the blueprints of nature.
Is he really claiming that this kind of mathematical composition is a biologically male trait? That is a massive and I imagine highly controversial claim.
Yeah.
How does he justify that?
It's a core pillar of the book, and it raises an important question about cognition, which the author addresses directly. He cites a 2012 meta-analysis by a researcher named Halpern,
Okay.
which suggests that men, on average, perform better in spatial temporal reasoning tasks. This is the exact cognitive ability required to mentally rotate a 3D object in space, or, as the book argues, to follow complex polyphonic lines in a Bach fugue, where multiple independent melodies are weaving around each other simultaneously.
So he's saying that keeping track of 4 different melodies at once is like doing 3D geometry in your head.
Exactly. And the author contrasts this with fMRI scans that he claims show women's brains displaying greater limbic or emotional response to music.
Okay.
He uses this biological baseline to claim that modern culture is fundamentally misguided. He argues that our education system and cultural institutions are incorrectly teaching young people that music is primarily about feeling.
Right.
The great male composers, he argues, viewed it as intellectual warfare and structural architecture.
So let's bring this back to the listener. What does this all mean for you, putting on your headphones today?
Right.
The book is saying that if you are a man listening to complex, mathematically rigorous music, You aren't just enjoying a tune. Your brain is actively solving a cognitive puzzle.
Exactly.
You are reverse engineering the beat and the harmony in real time. And when the tension of the chord progression resolves, the feeling you get is one of triumph, of having solved the puzzle, not just emotional comfort.
That is the precise argument. It's about conquering chaos. But the author doesn't just keep this in the realm of abstract mathematics and brain scans. He takes this biological argument even deeper into our actual physical bodies. He moves from the mind to the chest cavity.
Right, let's shift to the second major part of the book's thesis. We are moving from the high-minded math of Bach down into the dirt. Let's talk about bass, testosterone, and the warrior spirit.
The author's argument regarding low frequencies and rhythm is one of the most primal, visceral points in the entire book. He posits that deep bass and driving, relentless rhythms are the primal voice of male authority, order, and mobilization. He notes that across thousands of years of human civilizations, deep sound has been the exclusive property of male authority.
Like generals and high priests.
Yes, patriarchs.
Yeah.
It wasn't designed for entertainment, it was psychological dominance engineered to synchronize men.
He gives some incredible historical examples of this that really paint a picture.
Yeah.
He talks about the 45 hertz pulse of war drum.
Yes, 45 hertz is a very specific, incredibly low frequency. It's right at the edge of what human hearing can cleanly distinguish as a tone.
It's super deep.
But more importantly, it's a frequency you feel physically before you even process it mentally.
He brings up the ngoma drums of the Zulu warriors. Imagine standing on a plain in South Africa and feeling the ground shake before you even see the army over the horizon.
Terrifying.
He also mentions the kudum drums mounted on Ottoman war elephants. He claims these drums could be felt 10 miles away across a battlefield.
And he doesn't just focus on drums. He talks about the tubas and tympanums of a Prussian march.
Oh, right.
The author points out that when the Prussian army marched on Paris in the 1870s, they didn't march to silence. They marched to a massive wall of low-end brass and percussion.
Oh.
He states that it wasn't culture, it was conquest with a soundtrack. The sheer acoustic force of hundreds of men playing tubas in unison was designed to terrify the enemy and embolden the troops.
Okay, so loud drums and tubas make for good military parades. But what is the actual science behind this? Why does a marching band make people feel unified?
The science the author brings in here is fascinating. He points out that these martial rhythms typically sit around 120 to 240 beats per minute.
That's a fast driving tempo.
Very fast. He cites 2016 research from Harvard University confirming that synchronized drumming at these tempos actually increases heart rate coherence among the drummers.
Their hearts beat together.
Exactly. And more importantly, it triggers massive spikes in oxytocin and testosterone in men.
Oxytocin, is that the cuddle hormone?
It is often called that in popular science, yes, because it promotes bonding between a mother and child. But in a group of men engaging in synchronized physical activity, oxytocin promotes fierce in-group loyalty and trust.
Oh, that makes sense.
Combined with the aggression and drive of testosterone, it forges a collective warrior spirit. When men move in time together, striking a drum or marching to a beat, they cease to be individuals. They become a unified organism.
Right.
The author argues that this is an ancient biological technology used to build civilizations and win wars.
And here is where the book makes a massive pivot to critique today's world. If 120 to 240 beats per minute builds a warrior, what does modern music build? The author actually analyzed over 200 top 40 pop songs from the year 2020.
He did, and his findings are central to his critique. He found that a staggering 87% of those hit songs sit tightly between 80 and 90 beats per minute.
80 to 90, so significantly slower than the war drums. What is the significance of that specific tempo?
80 to 90 beats per minute is the tempo of a resting human heartbeat. The author claims this tempo is mathematically designed to pacify listeners. If a war drum elevates your heart rate to prepare you for battle, an 80 BPM pop song anchors your heart rate to a state of rest.
It calms you down.
Exactly. He argues this essentially turns audiences into passive consumers lounging on a couch rather than mobilized men ready for action. He famously quips in the book that we have swapped war chants for podcast binges.
It's a striking image. And to illustrate this contrast, he looks at modern audio production. He uses Dr. Dre's album 2001 as a rare modern example of masculine authority in sound.
Yes, the author notes that Dr. Dre explicitly tuned his sub-bass kicks on that album to hit right around 45 hertz.
The same as the war drums.
Exactly. Why? because that specific frequency physically resonates within the human chest cavity. When you're sitting in a car and a Dr. Dre beat drops, your ribs literally vibrate.
That's very true.
The author argues this establishes physical dominance. You don't just hear the music, you are physically forced to obey its vibration. It is the modern equivalent of the Ottoman War elephant drum.
But then he looks at the other side of the spectrum, what he calls the female-coded modern aesthetic. And this part of the book is going to make a lot of people angry. He points to artists like Billie Eilish, or the massive trend of lo-fi study beats that get billions of views on YouTube.
Right. The author argues that this style of music, characterized by whispered, close-mic'd vocals, muted bass lines, and sluggish tempos, it triggers a parasympathetic nervous system response.
The parasympathetic nervous system, that's the rest and digest mode, right? The opposite of fight or flight.
Exactly. He literally calls this genre of music audio Valium.
Audio valley.
He claims it is explicitly designed for emotional comfort. It acts as a weighted blanket for an anxious, overstimulated generation. But he views this as a profound negative. He argues it is replacing the war drum, which was designed to build strength, resilience, and action with an acoustic sedative.
Think about that for a second. If you were listening to this right now, think about your own Spotify habits.
Yeah.
You might put on a chill study beats playlist while you work, thinking it just helps you focus. But the book is arguing that you are actively conditioning your nervous system to be passive and docile.
What's crucial to understand about the author's thesis here is his belief that this isn't an accident of changing tastes.
He thinks it's deliberate.
He argues that replacing deep, driving, authoritative bass with soft, emotionally fragile, high-pitched vocal loops is an ideological conquest. He states that a culture that constantly tells men to soften up, to be vulnerable, and to share their feelings is deliberately starving them of the auditory foundations of their own biology.
He even brings up military crowd control to prove how powerful frequencies are, right?
Yes. He notes that the U.S. Army and various riot police units around the world have tested low-frequency sound cannons for crowd control.
Wow.
It proves that deep frequencies are fundamentally about exerting physical control and establishing order over a chaotic crowd. By removing that dominance from popular music, he argues, you remove the sonic blueprint for masculine authority.
Okay, so if the biological and mathematical foundations of masculine music are being systematically erased, the logical next question is, who is pulling the strings?
Exactly.
And that leads us straight into the third major section of the book, which is a brutal critique of the modern music industry. The author titles this section, The Death of the Composer and the Tyranny of the Algorithm.
This is where the book transitions from history and biology into modern economics. The author argues that the solitary male genius, the archetype of a Beethoven or a Bach working in isolation to build a masterpiece, has essentially been murdered by corporate committees and streaming algorithms.
And he claims these algorithms are driven by what he terms a gynocentric agenda that prioritizes emotional vulnerability and instant gratification over structural mastery.
To understand this, we have to look at the economics of genius as the book lays them out. Let's talk about Spotify. The author points out that Spotify adds an astonishing 100,000 new tracks to its platform every single day.
100,000 every 24 hours.
And the platforms pay fractions of a penny per stream. In this hyper-saturated environment, the author argues, a composer simply cannot survive by spending 3 years writing a complex hour-long symphony. The economic incentives absolutely forbid it.
Right, because the algorithms dictate the art. And how do the algorithms work? The book says they reward songs that trigger a dopamine spike within the first 3 seconds.
Yes, the skip rate is the most important metric in modern music streaming. If a listener doesn't hear a catchy hook or a vocal within the first few seconds of a track, they press skip.
Done.
The algorithm logs that skip, decides the song is bad, and stops recommending it to other people. The author argues this completely kills the slow, logical, architectural build of classical compositions. You can no longer write a piece that takes 5 minutes to establish its theme. The algorithm will execute your song before the first minute is over.
Think about how you use Spotify on your commute. If a song starts with a 45-second slow acoustic build, what do? You skip it.
We all do.
The algorithm knows you do that, so it effectively outlaws the slow build. It forces every artist to scream for your attention the millisecond the track starts.
And this demand for instant gratification leads to massive musical homogenization. The author brings up something called the pop-punk progression.
Right, the IV chord progression. Let's pause there because if you don't read sheet music or play guitar, that just sounds like Roman numerals. What does the IV progression actually sound like? Why is that specific math so manipulative?
Let's translate it. Think of a chord progression as a musical sentence. The I chord is your home base. It feels safe, stable, and resolved.
Okay.
Then you move to the V chord. This chord naturally creates tension. It feels like you've walked out your front door and a storm is coming. It demands to go somewhere.
Right.
Then you move to the Vi chord, which is a minor chord. It feels a little sad, a little vulnerable, like you're hiding from the storm.
Yeah.
And finally, you move to the Ivy chord, which lifts the mood back up, clearing the clouds and leading you perfectly right back to the I chord, your home.
So it's a micro journey. Home, tension, sadness, relief, home.
Exactly. It provides a simulated emotional arc that is perfectly contained and endlessly repeatable. The author points out that this specific progression has been used in over 150 Billboard #1 songs since the year 2000. It is everywhere.
Why do they use it so much if it's so repetitive?
Because it works. It provides a predictable, emotionally manipulative loop that never actually challenges the listener. It gives you the illusion of going on an emotional journey, but you never actually leave your comfort zone.
That makes total sense.
The author compares it to musical fast food. It is engineered to hit the exact right bliss points in your brain, but it offers zero nutritional value. It is safe, it is comfortable, and it is entirely risk-free.
And speaking of risk-free, this is where the book traces the depth of true live instrumentation to a very specific year, 1983.
Yes, 1983 is the year the Roland TR-808 drum machine was officially discontinued, ironically, right, as its influence completely took over the music industry. The author views the adoption of the drum machine as a catastrophic turning point.
Hold on, is he really claiming that a vintage drum machine from the 80s is responsible for the downfall of musical sovereignty? That seems like a massive leap. Millions of great hip-hop and electronic songs use the 808. How does he justify calling it a catastrophe?
He justifies it by looking at what the machine replaced: human friction.
Human friction.
He recalls a famous anecdote of a session drummer being fired at Capitol Records in the 1980s. The producer fired him because the drum machine was cheaper, it never missed a beat, and it didn't ask for overtime pay. The author argues this was the exact moment musical sovereignty died.
Because the machine doesn't make mistakes.
Exactly. When a live, breathing human drummer plays a beat, there is a natural push and pull. They might play slightly ahead of the beat during the chorus to build excitement, and pull slightly behind the beat during the verse to create a relaxed groove.
Right, there's physical tension.
But a drum machine places every single hit on a quantized, robotic grid. It is mathematically perfect, but humanly dead. The author argues that replacing the risk of a human drummer with a mechanized grid infantilized music production. It removed the risk of failure, and according to his philosophy, the risk of failure is what makes success sacred.
It's a wild thing to think about.
Yeah.
If there's no possibility of the drummer dropping a stick or losing the tempo, there is no real victory in finishing the song. It's just a program running.
We can extrapolate the author's belief further here because he views platforms like TikTok and Spotify as advanced extensions of this mechanical control. He views them as literal tools of behavioral engineering.
He talks about the loudness war, right?
Yes. The loudness war refers to the industry practice of compressing the dynamic range of a song so that the quietest parts and the loudest parts are exactly the same volume. Everything is pushed to the absolute maximum limit. There are no whispers and no explosions. There is just a constant screaming wall of sound.
Because if your song is quieter than the song before it in a Spotify playlist, the listener might skip it.
Precisely. And combined with TikTok forcing artists to write 15-second emotional hooks to go viral, the author claims the industry is deliberately breeding docility.
Wow.
The algorithms don't want you to think about structure. They want you to feel an immediate emotion, consume the content, and keep scrolling. He cites a 2023 MIT neuroscience study claiming that after listening to algorithmic, highly compressed playlists for extended periods, people's brains actually showed reduced emotional variability. They stopped responding to subtle shifts in tone and only responded to predictable dopamine spikes.
So the algorithm is literally rewiring our brains to only accept the musical equivalent of a slot machine payout. That is terrifying.
It really is.
So what does this all mean for the people actually trying to make music today? The artists themselves. That leads directly to the author's next target, the war on virtuosity and the pathologization of genius.
This section completely unpacks the popular 10,000-hour rule and makes the staggering claim that our modern society actually pathologizes the obsessive traits required to achieve greatness.
Let's break that down. Everyone has heard of the 10,000-hour rule, mostly from Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. The idea that if you practice anything for 10,000 hours, you become a master.
Right, but the author takes aim at Gladwell's popularization of it, arguing that Gladwell made it sound too sterile, too corporate. He leans instead on Anders Ericsson's original research at the Berlin Academy of Music, which Gladwell based his book on.
Okay.
The author's point is that skill isn't innate, and it isn't just about punching a clock for 10,000 hours. True virtuosity is constructed through grueling, isolated, deliberate, and often physically painful obsession.
He gives some intense historical examples of what this actual obsession looks like. He points to Mozart. We think of Mozart as this magical child prodigy who just woke up playing symphonies.
What? That's not true.
No, the book points out that Mozart had practiced over 3,500 hours by the time he was 5 years old, under his father's relentless, strict, and highly disciplined regime.
And he moves to modern examples, too. He points to Jimi Hendrix. Before Woodstock, Hendrix was in the Army, stationed at Fort Campbell. The book describes how Hendrix would practice his guitar for 8 hours a day in a closed barracks, while his fellow soldiers mocked him and threw things at him. He didn't care. He was obsessed.
He also brings up John Coltrane, the jazz legend. Coltrane was known to practice up to 12 hours a day. There are stories of him literally falling asleep with the saxophone still in his mouth.
Incredible.
And guys like Yngwie Malmsteen, the neoclassical metal guitarist, or Eddie Van Halen. The book describes them practicing in their bedrooms until the calluses on their fingers split open and bled onto the fretboard.
The author states that Van Halen's famous instrumental track Eruption wasn't just a guitar solo, it was a conquest. It was the sound of a man who had completely subdued the instrument through thousands of hours of pain.
A literal conquest.
But here's where the author's cultural critique bites incredibly hard. He asserts that modern psychology, our current education systems, and our broader culture now label this kind of hyper-focus, this relentless, singular drive, as a mental disorder.
What do you mean? How is practicing labeled a disorder?
He argues that if a young boy today exhibited the obsessive, singular focus of a young Mozart or a Van Halen, ignoring social cues, refusing to participate in group activities, locking himself in a room for 10 hours a day to master a repetitive mechanical skill, he would likely be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, or accused of exhibiting toxic masculinity.
Wow. It's true. If I spend more than 3 hours on a hobby today without moving, my smartwatch literally buzzes and asks me if I need to do a guided breathing exercise.
Imagine Mozart's dad getting a push notification to let the kid take a mental health break. Exactly. This is a core pillar of the author's argument. He claims that society now prefers to medicate boys into social compliance rather than let them become obsessed masters of a craft. He argues that traits like psychological rigidity, emotional restraint, and aggressive competitiveness, the exact traits which built the symphonies and solved the physics equations of the past, are now treated as sicknesses to be cured with therapy and medication.
He points a finger directly at modern music schools, too. He specifically calls out the Berklee College of Music.
Yes, he claims that elite conservatories have fundamentally changed their mission. He argues they have swapped rigorous, mandatory training in strict counterpoint and classical harmony for degrees in subjects like music therapy and songwriting for social change.
He basically says they traded objective excellence for participation trophies. He argues they prioritize the students' feelings and their self-expression over teaching them the brutal math of actually playing an instrument perfectly.
And you can connect this lack of physical discipline directly to the rise of pitch correction software, specifically autotune, which was invented in 1997.
How does autotune connect to the death of virtuosity? Isn't it just a stylistic effect?
The author argues autotune is a technological lie. Before 1997, if a singer wanted to hit a perfect high C, they had to practice for years. They had to develop their diaphragm, their vocal cords, their breath control. They had to endure the crucible of practice.
And autotune changes that.
Autotune allows an artist to completely bypass that crucible. It mathematically snaps an out-of-tune performance onto the correct pitch.
So it's the vocal equivalent of the drum machine grid we talked about earlier.
Exactly. The author argues it elevates mediocrity. It allows people who have put in 0 hours of practice to sound acceptable. And more devastatingly, he claims it completely silences the commanding, unedited, authoritative baritone voice of the past, replacing it with what he calls androgynous, pitch-corrected whispers.
Because if you don't need breath support to hit a note, you don't need a strong chest.
Right. The sound becomes fundamentally weaker.
Which naturally transitions us to a completely different, but deeply related dimension of the book's thesis. If we lose the math, if we lose the driving base of the warrior, and if we bypass the crucible of practice with software, what is left.
Right.
That brings us to the section titled Sacred Geometry and the Spiritual Crisis of Sound.
Here, the author examines the spiritual dimension of his thesis. He argues that music used to be a sacrament. It was an objective technology designed to dissolve the human ego and connect man to a higher cosmic truth. But today, he argues, it has become a narcissistic mirror, merely reflecting our own petty anxieties back at us.
He takes us back to architecture to prove this. We talked about the Parthenon earlier, but here he focuses on the great Gothic cathedrals, Chartres Cathedral and Notre Dame in Paris.
He points out that Notre Dame's nave is exactly 33 meters high.
Why 33 meters?
Because 33 is the age of Christ at the crucifixion. The building is theological math. And these massive stone cathedrals were built using the golden ratio in the Fibonacci sequence, not just to look pretty, but to serve as massive, resonant acoustic chambers.
Wow.
They were designed specifically to amplify Gregorian chants. The physical space was engineered to capture the overtones of the monks' voices and swirl them around the stone arches, creating a sound that seemed to come from heaven itself. The author argues this technology was designed to literally recalibrate the human nervous system toward the divine.
He also explains the theological and sonic role of something called the eisen. What is the eisen?
The eisen is a technique used in Orthodox Byzantine chant. It is a constant, unwavering drone note sung by a group of monks underneath the main melody. The melody moves and shifts, but the eisen never changes. It is a solid wall of sound.
Okay.
The author calls the eisen the audible representation of the logos, the divine command that holds chaos at bay.
So, the melody represents the human journey, going up and down, struggling. The drone note represents God, unchanging and foundational.
Exactly. He says it represents the soul's persistent longing for completion. It provides a massive, unmoving foundation that never resolves, but anchors everything above it. He contrasts this profound spiritual technology with what we have today as our modern cathedrals of sound.
Yes, he compares those sacred resonant spaces to today's massive electronic dance music festivals, like Tomorrowland or stadium pop concerts. What is his critique there?
He describes modern EDM festivals as Skinner boxes.
A Skinner box, like a psychological experiment where the rat presses a lever to get a pellet of food.
Precisely. He calls them sacraments without salvation. He says hundreds of thousands of people pack into these stadiums to chase dopamine highs. They are bombarded with flashing lasers, massive video screens, and 110 decibel bass drops.
And they just jump when the beat drops.
The crowd jumps in unison when the DJ pushes a button. But the author argues that unlike a cathedral, which points the listener toward moral or spiritual transformation, the festival points nowhere.
They just leave exhausted and dehydrated with a massive credit card bill, but their soul hasn't been changed.
That is exactly his point. They are seeking the physiological feeling of religious ecstasy, but without any of the religious duty, discipline, or truth. It is cheap grace. To illustrate the absolute devotion of the past, the author shares the famous anecdote of George Friedrich Handel composing the Messiah.
The Messiah, which contains the famous Hallelujah chorus.
Yes, Handel wrote this monumental, hours-long masterpiece in just 24 days. He barely ate. He barely slept. He was fueled by an absolute sense of duty and faith.
Unbelievable focus.
It's reported by his servants that they found him weeping at his desk, and when asked why, Handel claimed he saw all heaven before me when writing the Hallelujah chorus. He believed he was taking dictation from God.
And the author draws a sharp, unforgiving contrast between a man literally starving himself to transcribe the music of heaven and today's artists who write 15-second songs on TikTok purely to generate viral engagement, sell merch, and secure brand deals with energy drink companies. It is a devastating comparison.
It is. And it sets the stage for the final and undeniably most controversial section of the author's book.
Okay, yes, we are stepping into the minefield now. We need to remind you, the listener, impartially, that the author views musical composition and leadership as inherently biologically masculine traits. We are purely reporting his arguments here. He dives into three archetypes: the myth of the female composer, the lost rock god, and the missing conductor.
Let's begin with his arguments regarding the composer archetype. As we touched on earlier with the spatial temporal reasoning data, the author claims that abstract system building, the intense cognitive processing required to construct a Bach fugue or architect a 45-minute Beethoven symphony, requires a distinctively male cognitive profile.
Right. He cites fMRI studies suggesting men lean toward left hemisphere dominant spatial temporal reasoning, while women lean toward right hemisphere emotional resonance.
Yes. And the author uses this to assert that throughout history, men have been the ones to build the foundational mathematical architectures of sound, while women have excelled at interpreting and performing them. He explicitly contrasts Beethoven's structural genius with female historical figures like Clara Schumann and Fanny Mendelssohn.
Clara Schumann was an incredibly famous pianist in her time, correct?
She was a virtuoso pianist, yes, and a composer of smaller works. But the author categorizes women like Schumann and Mendelssohn as incredibly talented interpreters and performers, not as foundational architects who innovated entirely new musical systems or pushed the boundaries of symphonic math.
And he claims that modern attempts by musicologists to equate Clara Schumann's output with Beethoven's is historical revisionism.
He does. He claims it is driven entirely by a modern diversity quota mindset, attempting to retroactively apply 21st century egalitarian politics to the historical realities of biological differences. He argues that pretending a 3-minute piano prelude is equivalent to the architectural triumph of the Ninth Symphony diminishes the true nature of the male achievement.
Okay, moving from the composer to the conductor. The author writes what is essentially a lament for the old school orchestral conductor. He talks about titans of the 20th century, like Arturo Toscanini and Herbert von Karajan.
The author views the classical conductor as the ultimate archetype of male authority, the necessary autocrat. He tells a famous story of Karajan, who conducted the Berlin Philharmonic. Karajan supposedly fired a violinist mid-rehearsal.
Why, did the guy play the wrong note?
No, he played the right note, but he played it 5 milliseconds too early. Karajan fired him on the spot because playing early broke the structural line of the entire orchestra.
That sounds tyrannical.
To a modern sensibility, yes. But for the author, this extreme hierarchy is entirely necessary to produce high art. He argues that you cannot achieve flawless order out of chaos without one man imposing his will on the collective.
And how does he compare that to today?
He notes that modern orchestras and arts organizations are moving away from the dictator maestro model and toward artistic collectives or consensus-based leadership,
Where they all just agree on how to play it.
where the musicians vote on interpretations and everyone's voice is equal. The author argues that this egalitarian approach dilutes high art into bland, mediocre compromise. If everyone is in charge, no one is pushing the boundaries of excellence.
And finally, we get to the third archetype, the rock god and the concept of male bonding. The author discusses the transition from the dangerous, autonomous rock god of the late 60s and 70s to the modern pop star.
Right. Think of Woodstock in 1969. Think of Jimi Hendrix setting his guitar on fire, or Led Zeppelin destroying hotel rooms. The author isn't praising the destruction, but he is praising the unapologetic, aggressive, autonomous masculine energy.
The idea that the old rock gods didn't apologize, they ruled their stage.
Exactly. And he contrasts that with the sanitized, PR-trained, therapy-speaking modern pop star who immediately issues a groveling apology on Twitter if they offend a fraction of their audience. He argues the rock star has been thoroughly domesticated by a feminized culture that punishes aggressive male behavior.
Connected to this, and I found this to be one of the most interesting cultural observations in the book, is his deep sorrow over the loss of communal male singing.
Yes. The author talks about how, historically, men used to sing together constantly. They sang in barbershop quartets, they sang military cadences while marching, they sang sea shanties on whaling ships, they sang drinking songs in pubs.
And this wasn't just for fun, it had a biological purpose, right?
He points to sociological research showing that singing in groups raises testosterone, lowers cortisol, and builds deep civilizational strength and trust among men. When you breathe together and project sound together, you bond on a primal level.
But you never see a group of guys singing together today unless they are drunk at a football game. What killed it?
The author lays the blame on technology. Specifically, he points to the invention of the Sony Walkman in 1979, followed by the iPod, and now AirPods and streaming apps. He calls it the isolating personal sound bubble.
Think about that. We walk around all day with little white plastic speakers jammed in our ears, listening to our own custom-curated algorithmic playlists, entirely cut off from the acoustic environment of the people standing right next to us.
The author argues that this technological isolation has completely fragmented male solidarity. It has replaced the communal, bonding experience of making noise together with a passive, atomized consumer experience, leaving modern men feeling isolated, weak, and depressed.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground here. From Pythagoras measuring anvils, to Bach doing audio math, to Zulu war drums, to Spotify algorithms, to the biological differences in the brain, let's try to bring all these threads together for the listener.
To summarize the author's ultimate overarching takeaway, he argues that the geometry, the mathematical structure, and the hierarchical discipline of traditional music were not just aesthetic choices, they were the audible manifestations of Western civilization's masculine drive to conquer chaos and establish objective truth.
And he claims that this massive architectural foundation has been hollowed out by a modern culture that prioritizes cheap emotion, digital ease, algorithmic pacification, and what he sees as a gynocentric ideological agenda.
Yes, and his prescription for this cultural decay is uncompromising. He isn't just complaining, he is issuing a call to action for his readers. He claims that taking back the culture requires men to actively reject the algorithmic sludge being fed to them.
He demands that men insist on excellence. He literally tells his readers to go buy a physical instrument, learn to play it, endure the physical pain of building calluses and practicing scales, and study the rigorous architectural masters of the past.
He views this not just as a fun hobby or a musical revival, but as a necessary fundamental step for civilizational survival. He believes that if you rebuild the discipline of the male mind through the mathematics of music, you rebuild the foundations of the culture.
If you are part of the manosphere or consider yourself red-pilled, and you are intrigued by this incredibly deep dive into the historical structures of our institutions, and you want to explore these incisive arguments for yourself, you absolutely must read this book.
Highly recommended.
Again, please take a moment to like and subscribe to our show. Check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy the ebook, Geometry of Music, The Structure and Beauty, and do not forget to follow the author at Conrad Riker at his Substack. That's conradriker.substack.com.
It is certainly a text that forces you to critically examine the media you consume on a daily basis. Whether you agree with his biological claims and political conclusions or you find them offensive, the author's historical analysis of how technology, economics, and ideology have flattened our musical landscape is undeniably thought-provoking. It demands a response.
I want to leave you with a lingering, provocative thought to mull over the next time you put your headphones on or get in your car. If Pythagoras was right, and music is simply the audible geometry of the universe, what happens to the mind of a civilization when it willingly trades the massive architecture of the cosmos for the predictable 3-second dopamine loop of a corporate algorithm? Next time you hit play on your Spotify app, ask yourself, are you listening to the music, or is the music programming you?